January 1941. Enfield, England. Snow fell in wet, heavy clumps against the dim windows of the Royal Small Arms Factory. Inside, the air reeked of oil, sweat, and cold iron. The rhythmic clang of hammers echoed off the steel rafters, desperate music for a desperate time. Britain stood alone. France had fallen. Dunkirk's beaches still haunted the men who returned with nothing but sand and shame in their boots. The British Army, humiliated and half-armed, faced the unthinkable: invasion. In one corner of the factory, Major Reginald Shepherd and Harold John Turpin leaned over a drafting table. Sheets of grease-stained blueprints lay before them, crude sketches of a weapon so simple it bordered on absurd. A cylinder, a spring, a crude metal tube that barely resembled a gun. No polish, no finesse, just brutal efficiency. The soldiers who had handled Thompson's, sleek, expensive American submachine guns, would have laughed. But Shepherd wasn't designing for pride. He was designing for survival. "Can it be built in less than 5 hours?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes red from sleepless nights. Turpin hesitated, tapping the barrel drawing. "If we use stamped steel, sir, no milling, no machining. Just weld it, punch it, assemble it." Shepherd nodded slowly. "Good, because we'll need thousands. Fast." The order from the War Office had been clear. Create a submachine gun the British could produce by the tens of thousands, at a fraction of the cost of the Thompson. The Americans were charging £45 per gun. Britain couldn't afford that. Not in money, not in time. What Shepherd and Turpin conceived would cost barely 2. On the factory floor, men in overalls fed sheets of cold metal into presses. Sparks danced as rough receivers clattered into bins. The workers moved quickly, grim-faced, knowing each piece meant one more chance to arm a soldier against Hitler's juggernaut. There was no romance left in war, only necessity. When the prototype finally emerged, it looked like a plumber's nightmare. A skeleton of metal tubing, a side-mounted magazine, and a crude wire stock. The first test firing took place behind the factory, in a muddy clearing. Turpin loaded the magazine, chambered a round, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon chattered to life, an ugly, metallic burp that spat brass and smoke. It worked. Barely. The recoil kicked like a mule. The sights were a joke. But the bullets flew, and in that instant, they knew this ugly little creation might just save Britain. The weapon was christened after its birthplace, the ST from Shepherd and Turpin, and EN for Enfield. The Sten. Yet when word of the new submachine gun spread through the ranks, laughter followed. Troops mocked it as a toy gun, a plumber's dream, or worse, a death trap. "One burst and it'll blow your bloody hand off," grumbled a sergeant who had seen too many prototypes jam. Still, production began. Factories across Britain, even bicycle shops and typewriter plants, retooled to make its parts. Each gun could be assembled by a single man with little training, using little more than a vise and a hammer. The Sten wasn't born of genius. It was born of terror. The kind of fear that strips invention down to its bones. As Shepherd and Turpin watched the first crates marked Sten Mk1 roll out of the warehouse, they understood what they had created wasn't a masterpiece. It was a message. Britain wasn't done fighting yet. In the months that followed, the Sten would find its way into every corner of the war, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the alleyways of occupied France. It would arm commandos, paratroopers, and resistance fighters alike. But in these early, fragile days of 1941, it was still an experiment, crude, untested, and scorned. What no one yet knew was that this cheap, ugly little gun was about to change warfare forever. June 1942, somewhere in southern England. A grey dawn broke over the training fields, the mist clinging low across the grass like smoke on a battlefield. Rows of British soldiers stood with their new weapons slung at their sides. The Sten WWII, the latest version of Shepherd and Turpin's creation. Its rough steel and simple lines gave it an unfinished look, as though it had been pulled straight from a factory mold and thrust into the hands of men who didn't quite trust it. Sergeant William Bill Hardy scowled as he inspected the weapon. "Looks like it was made out of spare car parts," he muttered, thumbing the bolt. It felt too light, too hollow, but his commanding officer had been clear. This was the weapon of the new British infantry. "Cheap, nasty, and expendable," Hardy said under his breath. "Just like us." When the live fire exercise began, the Stens barked across the field, short bursts of 9mm rounds rattling into straw dummies. Some jammed, others misfired. But the ones that worked fast. The men began to realize something. This gun could spit death as quickly as any German MP-40, and at a tenth of the cost. In the following months, the Sten spread across Europe like wildfire. Paratroopers carried it into the night skies over France. Commandos strapped it to their backs as they raided enemy installations along the coast. And perhaps, most remarkably, the weapon became the lifeline of the underground. Resistance groups in occupied countries smuggled them through secret networks, their parts often dropped in crates by the Royal Air Force. In the alleys of Paris, in the forests of Poland, and in the back rooms of Dutch safe houses, men and women learned to load, aim, and fire the strange British gun that arrived in pieces, wrapped in oilcloth. The Sten was ugly, yes, but it was democratic. It didn't require training from Sandhurst or the resources of an army arsenal. Anyone could use it, anyone could fix it, and anyone could kill with it. One French resistance fighter, codenamed Pierre, recalled the first time he held one. "It looked like a child's toy," he said later. "But when I pulled the trigger, it sang." Meanwhile, in North Africa, British troops put the Sting to its first true test in open combat. At the Battle of El Alamein, amidst the choking dust and the roar of tank engines, soldiers used it in close quarters assaults through enemy trenches. Its small size made it ideal for room clearing and ambushes, and though it jammed under sand and grit, the troops learned to treat it like an old friend, temperamental, but dependable if handled right. By late 1943, production had soared past 2 million units. The War Office couldn't believe it. A gun that cost less than a soldier's uniform, made by bicycle factories and sewing machine workers, had become the backbone of the British arsenal. And yet, the Sten's reputation was still a paradox. To some, it was a savior. To others, a hazard. There were stories, whispered in the barracks, of men accidentally shooting themselves when the gun's crude bolt slipped. The Sten could fire if dropped, and its safety catch was barely functional. Many soldiers carried it with the bolt closed and a prayer that it wouldn't go off on its own. But war is rarely about perfection. It's about presence. And the Sten was everywhere. In one daring raid in occupied Norway, British commandos from the Special Operations Executive carried silenced Sten WWII models, fitted with crude suppressors that reduced their gunfire to a soft, hissing cough. They crept through the darkness, killing guards silently before detonating explosives on a German hydroelectric plant. The Germans never knew what hit them. It was the birth of modern clandestine warfare, and the Sten was its instrument. Back in Enfield, Shepherd and Turpin watched their crude little invention evolve, adapt, and spread beyond anything they had imagined. They had built it for defense, but it was now an instrument of resistance and rebellion, the weapon of the common man. And in the shadows of Europe, that mattered more than anyone realized. Autumn, 1943. Occupied France. The night was wet and cold, the kind that sank into your bones. Beneath the stone arches of a bridge outside Lyon, a small group of resistance fighters gathered in silence. A British Halifax bomber had just passed overhead, leaving behind a parachute crate that now lay cracked open in the mud. Inside were radio parts, explosives, and a half-dozen Sten guns, unassembled, wrapped in waxed paper. A young woman named Colette knelt beside the crate, her fingers trembling as she lifted one of the guns. "Mon Dieu," she whispered. It was light, almost too light, and so simple she could piece it together by feel alone. An older fighter, René, showed her how to load the 32-round magazine. He grinned. "This is how we'll make the Boche bleed." Across occupied Europe, scenes like this played out night after night. The Sten gun had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol. The Germans had their precision-engineered MP40s, their polished rifles, their military might. But the resistance had the Sten, a crude, handmade-looking British machine that fired bullets just the same. Soon, the gun was everywhere. In the hands of Polish partisans rising up in Warsaw, in the grip of Yugoslav fighters ambushing German patrols, even in the pockets of assassins stalking Nazi officers through the streets of Paris and Prague. In Denmark, resistance cells smuggled Stens through fishing boats and buried them in fields. In the Netherlands, underground printers forged manuals and diagrams, showing how to maintain or even build them from scratch. In Czechoslovakia, machinists created their own homemade versions using scavenged metal. The Sten had become the first truly people's submachine gun, and its impact reached far beyond the battlefield. German intelligence reports from 1944 began noting the weapon's disturbing prevalence among enemy irregulars. A single Sten could change the power balance of an entire village. It didn't just give the resistance a weapon, it gave them hope. That same year, the Sten's silenced variant, the WWII, was smuggled into France for Operation Jedburgh, where British and American special forces joined the resistance. These men moved behind enemy lines, coordinating sabotage before D-Day. The whispering Stens became their ghosts in the dark, killing sentries, destroying train tracks, cutting German communications. A Jedburgh officer later wrote, "You didn't aim a Sten, you pointed it. It wasn't elegant, but it was alive. It did exactly what it needed to do." As the Allies advanced through Normandy, Stens appeared everywhere, in the hands of civilians who emerged from basements and forests, taking up arms against retreating German forces. It was chaotic, it was raw, and it was personal. For many, the gun was the bridge between occupation and liberation. Back in London, the War Office watched in disbelief as their stopgap weapon became an icon of resistance. Over 3 million had been produced by now, each one costing less than $3 to make. Factories that once built baby carriages or lamps were now stamping out gun barrels and triggers. Housewives packed them in crates. Mechanics tested them in garages. The entire nation had, in one way or another, built the Sten. But even as it empowered millions, the Sten carried a darker truth. Its simplicity meant it could be copied. And it was. By 1944, the Germans themselves were making replicas, rechristening them as the MP3008. The irony was brutal. A weapon designed to fight fascism was now being used by the fascists themselves. Still, it didn't matter. The Sten had already outgrown its origins. As the Allies crossed into Germany in late '44, soldiers carried Stens through shattered towns and burning streets. It wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable, cheap, and replaceable. The perfect tool for a war that had turned the entire world into a factory of survival. And when the news came in spring of 1945 that Hitler was dead and the Reich had fallen, many of those same soldiers laid their Stens down, scarred, dented, their paint worn off by war. It wasn't a beautiful weapon, but it had helped end one of the ugliest wars in human history. London, 1946. The war was over. The empire was exhausted. In a dimly lit storeroom of the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, racks upon racks of Sten guns stood silent, their barrels oiled, their metal dull under a film of dust. Some still bore the scuffs and dents from Normandy or Arnhem. Others were fresh from the assembly line, produced too late to see combat. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Turpin, now grayer and slower, walked between the rows with his hat in hand. He had seen his toy gun, as many once called it, become the backbone of an army, and then, almost overnight, vanish into obsolescence. The post-war world had little love for the Sten. It was crude, inelegant, a relic of desperation. Britain was already developing new designs. The Sterling, the Patchett, more refined, more professional. The Sten was destined for surplus auctions and military aid shipments to former colonies, and yet the weapon refused to disappear. From Palestine to Vietnam, from Burma to the streets of Belfast, the Sten resurfaced again and again, passed from soldier to rebel, from police to insurgent. Its simplicity made it immortal. A blacksmith with a welder and a set of blueprints could recreate it in a week. In the slums of Calcutta and the hills of Algeria, homemade versions appeared, some almost identical to the original, others twisted into new shapes. It had become the weapon of the underdog, the outnumbered, the forgotten. In 1947, a young officer from the newly formed Israeli Haganah stood before a line of recruits, teaching them to handle the same British gun once used to suppress uprisings in the Middle East. "This," he said, holding the weapon high, "is how we will survive." The irony was profound. A British gun, built to defend democracy, was now arming those who sought to create nations of their own. Meanwhile, in Britain, the men who had made it possible faded quietly into history. Major Reginald Shepherd returned to engineering. Turpin retired, rarely speaking about his wartime work. Even as historians wrote volumes about Spitfires, Enigma, and the atomic bomb, the humble Sten rarely earned a paragraph. But among veterans, and in the secret files of intelligence officers, its legend endured. Special operations veterans remembered the hiss of its silencer during missions in France. Paratroopers remembered how it fit into a rucksack before jumping into Arnhem. Resistance fighters remembered how it felt to hold one for the first time, the weight of defiance in their hands. Decades later, museums would display the Sten behind glass, its plain steel body and awkward magazine a stark contrast to the sleek rifles beside it. Tourists would look at it and shrug. "It looks cheap," they'd say. And in that, they were right. It was cheap. That was its genius. Because in 1941, Britain didn't need perfection. It needed production. It didn't need beauty. It needed survival. The Sten wasn't designed to impress. It was designed to endure. And in doing so, it helped turn the tide of a war that might otherwise have drowned the free world. When asked years later what he thought of his creation, Turpin simply said, "It was ugly, it was dangerous, but it worked, and that was enough." In the end, the Sten wasn't just a gun. It was proof that necessity could outfight elegance, that invention could rise from desperation, and that sometimes history's greatest weapons are not those built to last, but those built to matter.